thank you to the governor and to the lieutenant governor for a couple of things. One, the tone with which the administration has conducted itself over a very challenging timeframe. And secondly, to thank the governor and his entire team for their willingness to reach out and to seek input from a wide variety of sources, including the business community and most especially Associated Industries of Massachusetts, its directors, its members, and its staff. And really a debt of gratitude for all that we've been able to accomplish together. So Governor, I know we have a somewhat limited time, so I just want to jump to a couple of broad questions and give you an opportunity to sort of say what you'd like to say to the group. As the term draws to an end, what are you hoping and thinking your legacy will be for the Baker-Polito administration?
Well, John, first of all, thanks for your leadership and thanks for the sort of open door policy you and we have had over the course of the many years. Geez, going all the way back to when I was working for Governors Weld and Cellucci back in the 90s. Let me start by saying that this is the only job I've ever had where you actually have to tell people you're leaving a year in advance, which makes it unusual in that regard. Usually, if you're going to leave, you say you're going to leave and then, you're gone. And so there's this tendency to treat the fact that I said I wasn't running for re-election as, well, that's over. But there's actually a lot on the plate that we need to work through between now and the end of calendar 22. There's tax policy, okay? We have the Commonwealth of Mass is awash in revenue, and we've been saying since January, this needs to go back to a piece of this needs to go back to the taxpayers. And I really do anticipate that there will be some sort of tax cut that makes it through the process between now and the end of the legislative session. We have a healthcare bill in front of the legislature. We have an economic development bill in front of the legislature. We have an infrastructure bill in front of the legislature. We have legislation to deal with some of the loopholes that exist in our law that put women and kids in significant risk, and have demonstrated that through a series of roundtables we've done across the Commonwealth over the course of the first half of this year. And I really do think our priorities and the way I'm thinking about this job is very much about what's in front of us and not what's behind. What I will say, though, is I do think housing remains one of our existential problems. We are the second or third most expensive housing market in the country, depending upon which survey you look at. If you go back to 1980, we were right in the middle of the pack back then. And the big thing that changed between 1980 going back and forward is we just stopped building a lot of new housing. Post World War II through 1980, we built roughly almost to 1990. We built about 30,000 new units of housing a year. We've been building about 8,000 or 9,000 new units of housing since then, and that's a problem. And we have a tremendous shortage in housing. I do think some of the work we did with the legislature and with our colleagues in local government to change some of the rules around zoning and housing production will help. But when your average housing price is over $750,000, you make it very hard for people in their 20s and 30s to decide this is where they want to build their future. I consider this to be one of the major challenges we continue to face as a Commonwealth going forward. I think the two things I might mention, sort of looking into the rearview mirror, one is I do believe that COVID and the pandemic was sort of the challenge of a lifetime. And I do think the balanced and collaborative approach we took here in Massachusetts kept people safe, and at the same time made it possible for our economy to get pretty much back, not quite, but pretty much all the way back to where it was in 2019. That's part of the reason why our tax revenue numbers are through the moon. And I totally get there was an enormous amount of dislocation, but I also believe that people here sort of rallied around one another and dealt with this in many respects in a way that we should all be proud of. I think the second thing I would mention is we really created, through our work with the legislature and onward, an affordable offshore deep water wind industry in the United States of America. And when people look back on this one, That first procurement that we put out based on the legislation I signed in 2016 was the first time people ever saw a price point when it came to offshore wind in the US that was affordable. And that led to a stampede of opportunity and interest in developing deep water offshore wind in the Atlantic. And I think that in many ways is going to be a legacy event for all of us. And the final thing I'll mention, which doesn't get much attention, no administration has ever spent more money modernizing the MBTA than we have. And I said when we took office that we were going to do this. I said we get no political credit for it because most of it's invisible. The only thing you ever really get credit for in transportation is when you expand something. Just investing in your current assets never gets anybody's attention. But I'm telling you, nobody spent more to modernize that system. I have a piece of the MBTA right here in my office. It's a piece of it's an electrical cord that was cut by the Boston. I think it was cut by one of the Boston agencies when they were doing work, I think, on water and sewer efforts. And it was installed and still functioning. It was installed in 1936 and still functioning. And the great challenge we have with this system is electronics, switches, signals, tracks, the whole thing. A lot of that stuff, even though we've done a ton of work to modernize it, is still 20, 30, 50, 60, 70, like this one, 80, 90 years old. And it needs to get upgraded still.
So those of us that know you well are not surprised to hear that between now and the end of this legislative session and the end of the year, your intention is to run through the tape and make sure you continue to rack up achievements. One of the things that I think is worth a conversation is, particularly in light of what happens in other jurisdictions, your administration's willingness to work particularly with the legislature and how important that's been to you as a guiding principle. Would you care to talk a little bit about, what motivates you in that space and why you think you've been successful?
Well, first of all, Lieutenant Governor Karen Polito and I both served previously in state government and local government. She and I were both members of our select board. She served for 10 years in the House. I served for 8 years in the cabinets of Governors Weld and Cellucci. So we came into this with somewhat of an appreciation of the relationships that exist in state government, but also an understanding about the importance of having a strong relationship with our colleagues in local government. And I think the single thing I would say about this is something Bill Weld said to me a million years ago, which is you never know where your next coalition's coming from. And if you look at a lot of the folks that we've worked with on a lot of issues over the course of the past 8 years, there's a lot of interesting collaborators there. A lot of people who don't always agree on much of anything, but who did agree on X. A bunch of people who typically you wouldn't see collaborating on whatever, working to get somewhere on Y. And I think from my point of view, I think one of the things we've tried to instill in the work we've done and with our team too. I mean, generally speaking, it's not that hard for people in the legislature to talk to folks on our team, to engage them on issues that have concerns for them in their districts. And I think at the end of the day, what people in the public care about is the work. The noise is entertaining, but and sometimes depressing, but it's the work ultimately that people judge you on. And we've tried really hard to make our tenure about the work. And I, there are plenty of things I don't agree with people on, right? But is that really worth it at the end of the day to turn it into a so-called federal case when that's not all, that shouldn't be all that unexpected? I mean, my mom and dad, I've said this before, they Democrat, Republican. My dinner table around my house growing up was, let's just say a lot of my friends found it highly entertaining. But that was, it wasn't personal. It wasn't, it wasn't like they never agreed on anything. It's just that they didn't agree on everything. And I think that's been one of the things we've tried to instill in our team generally, which is, there's work to be done. Focus on the places where you can get stuff done and where there's common ground. And the other stuff is almost just part of the nature of the messiness of government. And it's okay. It's what democracies are like.
Yeah, I think particularly as I look at other parts of the country, I appreciate that attitude. And, it's certainly the way AIM tries to conduct itself as well. You just never know when or where the next alliance will come from. I'm mindful of time. I just have one final question I wanted to ask you as you, and again, I know you don't like to focus on sort of the end of times, eschatologically, as they say in theology. But as you contemplate the lone walk down the front stairs of the State House, what advice would you give your successor, whoever that happens to be?
Well, I wouldn't just give this advice to my successor, and I wouldn't think about it in the context of the long walk. My single biggest piece of advice would be that democracy by design is supposed to be a team sport, okay? And the reason it's designed as a team sport is you want a lot of voices to be represented in the conversation. And that means that it will probably take longer to get things accomplished that you think are obvious and important to get accomplished. But that's kind of the price you pay for the dialogue. And when I think about housing choice, when I think about a lot of the work we did on addiction, when I think about the wind stuff we talked about, and when I think about a number of the items that are currently before the legislature right now, and a lot of the projects we work with our colleagues in local government on, a lot of them, in many cases, probably took longer than the proponents would have wanted them to take. But if you stick with it and you recognize that usually it's not personal, it's just, people have questions, people have concerns, people have a variety of interests and constituencies. You can usually get a lot of stuff across the line. And I think too many times in a world we live in where everybody can find anything on their phone in 5 seconds by Googling it, everybody thinks the answer to everything should be like this. Well, in the real world, the stuff that lasts takes a while. And I think it's important for everybody, especially those in public life and especially those in elected life, to understand and recognize that that's both the beauty and in some respects, the challenge of democracy and hearing a lot of voices when you're trying to get things done.